I watched a taped version of the awesome appropriation versus appreciation discussion that was held in this room. And near the end of that discussion, I believe the question was asked by one of the panelists or an audience member whether they actually saw this book as a satire. And folks seemed a little bit skeptical. And I just wanted to ask you all, do you feel like, yeah, this is a satire, or are you like, I don't know?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, that's perfect. So I don't blame you for sort of being uncertain, and in some ways that's kind of the point of how I'm going to approach this. I'm going to talk about how I think the satire is working, and I'm also going to talk about reasons why you might not have noticed it, or why it was underplayed. So I hope that makes sense. I want to start with a pretty simple definition of satire that I derived from my reading of Wikipedia. And basically, satire is a humorous critique of human behavior, either at the individual level or at the social level. And I've just got this little formula that I hope you can keep in mind as I talk. So it's a critique done in a humorous way. That is satire. So the critique piece usually means that satire is depicting bad behavior or bad ideas. And if you start with that basic element of satire, and you think about this novel, you'll realize that there are a lot of satirical targets in this novel because there's a lot of bad behavior in the novel. Okay, so how do you write the humor part? And I want to suggest a concept for you all, that humor is a structural thing. For the moment, we're almost putting aside whether you laugh or not. But humor is a certain relationship between elements. So in general, humor is created by some sort of incongruity or mismatch among different elements of a situation. So one obvious way to create a mismatch is by inventing a character who plays against type. So The Wizard of Oz, you got the Cowardly Lion. Funny. Anybody watch Anchorman, the Will Ferrell movie? Okay, so Anchorman, you've got this boorish dolt anchor person who in the middle of the movie all of a sudden busts out and plays improvisational jazz flute. Okay, you don't expect that from him, and so that's kind of funny. And then in Yellowface, we have June, who is a self-proclaimed liberal who pulls what I would consider some white supremacist moves in the novel. So there's mismatches between pretension and reality. Another type of mismatch is basically irony. So according to Wikipedia, irony is defined as the juxtaposition of what on the surface appears to be the case and what is actually the case or to be expected. So for example, when Candace suggests that June use a sensitivity reader, her bosses call her out for poor boundaries, okay? And the irony is that we know that June is the one who has exhibited poor boundaries by stealing Athena's work, okay? And how Candace is bullied by the publishers when everybody sort of has these pretensions to promoting diversity and so on is also ironic. Okay, so that's the structure of a joke. And whether you actually find these incongruities or mismatches funny enough to laugh at, even to a degree whether you'll notice them in the first place, depends on delivery. Okay, and the delivery depends on things like, well, who do you sympathize with in the situation? How exaggerated or absurd are the images or the language that's being used? How good is the comedic timing? So the more absurd or exaggerated the images are, the more likely you're going to laugh out loud. So I want to give you another piece of the formula. A super simple formula for laugh out loud satire is you got the critique, you got the structure of humor, which is those mismatches, and then you've got a certain delivery. You're going to sympathize with certain people in the situation, you're going to look for the level of absurdity, exaggeration, wacky images, and the timing. And if all those things come together, you will laugh. Okay? What's that?
I said, well, they must not have for me. I never laughed.
Well, yeah, we're going to see why, I think. I hope. So conversely, if any of the three main components is compromised or very subtle, you may not laugh. okay? For example, if the imagery is realistic and not exaggerated, that piece of the delivery won't be that funny. If the underlying imagery or situation is serious rather than zany or absurd, there might be an incongruity, but you're not going to laugh. If who you sympathize with in the moment is not straightforward, we tend to laugh at people who are at a little bit of a distance from us. Sometimes the people we don't sympathize with are the ones we're most likely to laugh at. Okay? So when any of those things are compromised, you may have the structure of a humorous situation, meaning there's incongruity or mismatch, but the humor may either be drier or darker, or you might not get it right away. Okay? Are you with me? Okay. I hope I'm not taking just a basic, simple concept and making it way more complicated than it needs to be. But so let's start with an instance of humor. Okay, so we're going to use our little formula, but we're going to ignore the critique piece and the delivery piece and just look at humor. So this is the basic opening joke, if you will, of this novel, Death by Pancake. Okay? This is funny, isn't it? That a pancake could equal the graveyard, could be death. So it's incongruous or ridiculous, as June says, to be killed by a pancake. But it is not incongruous to be killed by a handgun. It's very unfunny to be killed by a handgun. So this is unfunny. This is funny. Unfunny, funny. Okay, oops.
Plain humor. Thanks.
What happened? How do I want to respond to my little clicks? Well, we're going to be looking at this slide for a while. I don't know why I won't go back to this. Oh, there it is. Okay. So there is so that is funny. So let's use Death by Pancake to talk a little bit more about delivery, the delivery part of our formula. So how funny or unfunny choking on a pancake is depends on how the writer manages those elements of delivery, like sympathy, imagery, and timing. So I am totally against stereotyping mothers-in-law, okay? But if in the world of comedy, they are stereotyped and they're used to make jokes. I'm going to use that shorthand because it works for my little example. So the idea is like where sympathy lies. So this is why a stereotypical comic villain, like the mother-in-law, is useful to comedians because they are they're generally seen unsympathetically. So let's imagine an unsympathetic mother-in-law visiting the home of one of our great comedic leads. Who's a Lucille Ball fan? Okay, all right, okay. Who's maybe like a Whoopi Goldberg, Tina Fey?
Yeah.
So imagine your favorite female comedian in this role. I'll use Tina because that's what I put in my notes. So the mother-in-law comes to Tina's house and tries to please the mother-in-law by making her favorite breakfast, which is blueberry pancakes. So when the mother-in-law starts choking, our comic lead may look at her watch. She may have a little flash of glee because she does not like this mother-in-law, but then she's like, dang, I better do the Heimlich maneuver. And so she snaps to action and she bumbles around and she knocks over this bowl of whipped cream and the whipped cream falls on the floor and she picks up the mother-in-law to give her the Heimlich and she slips in the whipped cream so that her hands go from being around her mother-in-law's diaphragm to sliding up around her throat, just as her husband walks in the room and sees his wife choking his mother. If they're going for huge slapstick, that's the very moment when the mother-in-law projectile expels the pancake, it hits the husband in the face, and you get the laugh track, right? So those are all elements of delivery that turn choking on a pancake into comedy, okay? You don't actually kill the mother-in-law, so that minimizes that piece of things and makes it easier to laugh at. There is the slapstick piece of the pancake hitting the husband in the face. There is the daughter-in-law's reveal of her true feelings for the mother-in-law by choking her accidentally, okay? And you've got the other elements, the slipping in the whipped cream and so on. If the mother-in-law actually dies, though, Now we're in a much darker place. We're still in comedy, but we might be able to laugh if we really like Tina and we really don't like the mother-in-law, and we're very curious about how the husband and wife will now manage this problem, this issue in their marriage and the loss of the mother-in-law. But you can tell that having the character die has taken it to another level, okay? So when this scene happens in Yellowface, you're probably not laughing at all. You're probably not even thinking about laughing because Kuang is not piling on the slapstick. And your sympathy at that point in the novel is probably more with Athena than with June, okay? In terms of adding absurdity, like slipping in the whipped cream or having the accidental choking, we don't have any of that. It does cross June's mind to do a YouTube tutorial on how to do the Heimlich maneuver. I don't know if you remember that. That's kind of funny. And there might be a joke on just how online June is. That might be the humor there. But there really is no time for that. And here is the actual description of the moment of choking, which is very realistic and horrifying. Quote, "One hand goes to her throat, the other frantically taps my arm, her lips part, and out comes this muted, sickening rasp," unquote. And then as Athena dies, the only thing moving now is her shoulders, heaving in wild jerks like she's been possessed. Okay, it's a horrible scene, it feels terrible. The word possessed is a bit of exaggeration, which could tend towards comedy. Okay, whenever you exaggerate, you're doing comedic delivery a little bit. So possessed is on its way to that. But I think Kuang actually wants us to take her death super seriously because later in the novel, we have to believe that Athena believes the ghost of, I'm sorry, we have to believe that June believes the ghost of Athena is coming for her, okay? And she's going to have to confront that ghost on the exorcist stairs. So this little word, possessed, is a writer saying, I know what I got to do later in the book. I got to set that up. And I'm gonna not play this moment for laughs because it would really mess with tone, for one. And I need this other image, which is a horror image, not a comedy image, because that's going to be my big climax. And I need you to be thinking in terms of possession when we get there. Okay? So this is going to be one of several examples where Kuang has comic structure in her book, and she's got sort of bigger novel writing fish to fry. She's trying to create certain effects, and she's trying to keep you engaged in the story. So she's going to choose her words accordingly, and she's going to make it more realistic. So it isn't super funny then. It's not supposed to be. Okay, so that's the humor plus delivery part of our little formula. Now, if I can get this technology to work, I want to look at an example of full-on satire with tons of delivery to give you the joke. And this is a Saturday Night Live ad that satirizes ads the NFL runs about the NFL and the United Way. And it includes our whole formula. There's going to be critique, there's going to be a structural irony where the helper is mean, and there's going to be tons of exaggerated images. And please say a prayer while I try to make this. So we're going to see a video that was on Saturday Night Live, which is an example of satire that has all these elements. We're going to see a parallel moment in Yellowface. So that's why I'm showing you this particular video. Okay, so, alrighty, we'll get back there. Okay, there's that. Thanks for bearing with it here, folks.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this bit has all of the elements of satire that we've been talking about. You've got elements held up for critique, which is Peyton's bad mentoring, explicitly putting too much pressure on kids in sports is getting satirized. Maybe most slyly, the NFL's efforts to sort of whitewash their image, but the problems with traumatic brain injury, with domestic violence. So they want to create this image of NFL players and former NFL players as super caring and community oriented. And of course, there's Peyton emphasizes, or the voiceover, I'm sorry, emphasizes the ironic setup. I don't know if you heard it at the beginning, but they said, being a kid can be harder than it looks. Sometimes it helps to have an adult around. That's why Peyton Manning takes time out to help with local youth groups. And when they're in the huddle, he says, we're going to have fun. We're going to encourage each other. And the innocence and the vulnerability of the kids, I don't know if you noticed the boy had a cross on. So they're managing images at a very small level. The nobility of the adult member are all stressed in the voiceover. And then every single image that you saw, of course, plays against the loving mentor type. Peyton is abusive. He teaches them how to commit crimes. And the over-the-top exaggeration of the bad behavior makes it really clear that it's satirical. Okay.
He's also being censored too.
Yes.
Because he's using profanity.
He's using profanity with kids, which is a total no-no. I'm not even going to use profanity here, and you guys could take it. That's how bad he is. Okay. So there is a similar moment in Yellowface structurally. Okay. If you remember when June is teaching that creative writing class near the end of the book for high school students who identify as Asian American and Pacific Islander, and she ends up bullying her students in a not the same way, but in a like way. So that's the bad behavior that's held up for critique. There's also an ironic setup that is very similar to the setup in the SNL skit. June convinces herself to take the gig, and here's what she thinks to herself. This is a quote. Teaching is an unassailably noble calling. A well-phrased barb right now could irreparably destroy their confidence, but the right words of encouragement could help them fly. Okay, remember Peyton saying, we're gonna encourage you all. This is what a good mentor does. In June's case, so Peyton's also giving back to the community. June has very specific reasons for trying to give back to the AAPI community because she has appropriated, she's culturally appropriated, she's stolen from somebody in that community. And as with Peyton, helping kids through encouragement as a caring mentor is her goal. But when June overhears the students who have heard about her plagiarism problems, when she hears them critiquing her, she just retaliates by bullying them and then quitting her job. And that's a really strong example of playing against type, which we notice is one of those incongruous mismatches. So there is the structure of humor in Yellowface, but there are so many differences that make one satirical and funny, and the other one satirical but more subtly so. So in Peyton's video, it's the age of the kids, the escalation of the imagery, the physical humor, the kid getting hit in the groin, the other kids lying unconscious for crying out loud, the carjacking. So the exaggeration would make the satire really obvious, but it would also make the novel unrealistic if June is that bad to the kids, okay? So June is not gonna bully 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds, but she might bully ambitious fellow writers who are calling her out. Okay, so it's a more realistic motive for bullying. Peyton has no motive. He's just an overly competitive adult. He's got no legit motive. But it's a little bit more realistic that her buttons would be pushed. And so there's much less exaggeration. And so the structure of the situation is very similar, but you're probably not laughing. You're maybe not even noticing that she's being satirized. But she is being set up very much like Peyton is. So there are many instances in the novel where this type of satirical structure exists. Maybe the flagship action that is satirized is June's decision to put on Yellowface. So it's cultural appropriation in the most dishonest and exploitative terms. So it is, of course, ripe for critique. It's also framed ironically by the fact that June professes to be a liberal. June also rationalizes it in patently ridiculous terms. So here's how she's talking about the new name she adopted. Quote, nobody talks about the difference in how song might be perceived versus Hayward, No one says explicitly that Song might be mistaken for a Chinese name. And then later, when she's describing her new author photo, she writes, "During golden hour, I come off as nicely tanned, which makes me look sort of racially ambiguous. My eyes are cast demurely to the side, my mind full of profound and cryptic thoughts." Unquote. So even her expression is trading on old racist stereotypes about East Asians as quote unquote inscrutable. Her justification is laughably and ironically self-serving. She says, "I never lied. That's important. I never pretended to be Chinese." But in fact, that's exactly what she is doing. She is pretending to be Chinese. And her rationalization is absurd on its face. That absurdity is darkly funny, if that's where your sense of humor is. And it's also a realistic depiction of how people can justify microaggressions or other racist gestures. It's not quite as obviously as absurd as Peyton Manning teaching somebody to steal a car, okay? So the other major targets of satire that I won't go into in detail are the hypocrisy of the publishing industry, which pretends to want to promote diverse voices, but ends up silencing, marginalizing, and then expelling Candace, which we talked about a little bit before. There's June's basic inability to admit that plagiarizing Athena's work is wrong. And almost every attempt to rationalize it creates some sort of irony. And there's also the novel's humorous critique of the methods and rhetoric of online cancel culture. Again, you may not be laughing out loud at every instance, but the structure of the satire is there. So I want to complicate this satire, how she's doing satire in the book in a couple different ways. That's our formula: critique plus humor plus delivery equals satire. But there are moments in the novel when either the critique piece or the humor piece itself are thrown into doubt. So let's first take a look at a moment when the humor itself is thrown into doubt. So you could say, again, that every moment in which June falsely presents herself as the sole author of The Last Front is ironic and thus has a humorous structure. Every rationalization of what she's done, such as how she's honored Athena by making positive contributions to the novel, that only adds to the irony. But Kuang adds a motivation for June's theft that threatens to remove the humorous element from the situation. June feels that stealing Athena's novel draft is revenge for Athena stealing June's story about being raped in college and publishing it in the college's literary magazine without asking for June's permission or acknowledging June. So when June is stealing and rationalizing stealing, that's funny because there's a mismatch between her morality and what she's done, okay? When June steals from Athena as an act of revenge, it's not funny because there's no mismatch. It's payback, okay? So it erases the joke. And we only learn that Athena has stolen from June maybe about 2/3 through the novel. But once you learn that, it's harder to think about June's crime in the same way. So when you're exactly mimicking the offense, you steal my story, I steal your story, you have an eye for an eye. Or to be way too clever, you have an eye for an eye, as in capital I, as in I wrote this, as in the power to narrate for the power to narrate. Okay? So this motivation also blunts the humor because it complicates the question of sympathy. And this is another move that Kuang is making to make her novel work in some ways, but to make it work less obvious as a satire. So this blunts the humor because it complicates the question of sympathy. The stereotype of the bad mother-in-law is bad precisely because it creates a one-dimensional villain with whom it is hard to sympathize. It's essentially unrealistic because no one is one-dimensional. But as I was trying to say before, it's useful in comedy because the sympathy disparity between hero and villain allows us to laugh at the villain, even if she's choking on a pancake, even if she's in distress and hurt. But by making Athena do unlikable things, like stealing the story of June, and the stories of other people when she talks to them when she's gathering material, or unlikable things like keeping a distance from the Chinese American community. Remember, Candace says we all thought she was the B word, okay? So she has not endeared herself to the Chinese American community for various reasons. So there are ways in which the novel makes Athena not purely sympathetic, and then conversely, there are also moments when the novel shows June behaving reasonably. And those are signs that the novel wants to complicate our sense of sympathy. So most people have zero sympathy for June, and I get it. I totally understand it. But the novel does give us reasons to sympathize. For example, as I said, Athena has stolen from June. June is taking revenge or payback, which is at least understandable. June is the one who gives us the critique of cancel culture, which we might sympathize with, although she's doing it for very self-serving reasons, okay? But by pointing out all the erroneous assumptions and poor reasoning and absurd piling on, she is giving us a good critique of cancel culture. And sometimes June is in pain over what she's done. She goes back and forth between doubling down and kind of knowing, I'm getting caught, this is terrible. And so it's hard not to sympathize with somebody who's in pain, even if you know their reason for being in pain is totally their fault. So any sympathy that adheres to June, any sympathy that is taken from Athena, inhibits our ability to laugh at June, because our sympathy has been complicated. So this is also connected to a bigger novel constructing idea, which is that you want there to be suspense in your book. You want there to be the possibility for more than one outcome. And if your main character is consistently bad and could never choose to be better, has no redeeming qualities, and is simply the butt of all the jokes, the novel ends up getting really predictable. And there's no suspense or there's no reason to read on, unless you just love piling on some poor sap that you want to make fun of. So I believe that Kuang is restrained in general because she wants to create suspense about the outcome. And one of the major sources of suspense in the novel is whether June will ultimately break and confess to stealing Athena's work. And to make this plausible, Kuang has to do several things to make June seem like a reasonable person who has suffered in certain ways and also has a conscience at times. So you could say, as the novel goes back and forth, it's on a balance maybe on the question of whether it will ultimately be a satire, meaning landing on making fun of June, or whether it'll be a tragedy. It's most satirical if June keeps doubling down on her delusional rationalizations, but it has the potential for tragedy if June can admit her mistake and tear off her yellow face, like Oedipus gouging out his eyes at the end of Oedipus Rex. Of course, even after she does confess to Candace on the Exorcist stairs, she does decide to double down yet again, and doing so in some of the most telling, ironic, and absurd lines of the novel. Here's another quote. "Years of suppressed rage at being treated like a stereotype, like my voice doesn't matter, like the entirety of my being is constituted in those two words, white woman, bubble up inside me and burst," unquote. So the oppressor has finally talked herself into believing she's the oppressed. Instead of tearing off her yellow face, she decides to take it to a whole new level, impersonating a persecuted minority. But even here, though, the satire is a little bit complicated by the fact that as a woman, she does belong to an oppressed group. So there's some truth within the absurdity, which makes it somewhat less absurd, but then she's complicating the situation. And when you're parsing a complicated situation, you're probably not laughing. You're trying to figure out what should I think right now? Okay? So that's part of her, part of why the satire is subtle and why it's hard to laugh at. Okay, so far we've discussed the humor piece and we've discussed the delivery piece a lot. Let's finish by going back to the critique piece, because even here I think Kuang is introducing complexities. So the most striking example of calling the critique piece itself into question is how the novel handles the question of cultural appropriation, or the problem of cultural appropriation. Because putting on Yellowface is absolutely indefensible and is clearly satirized by the novel, we might think that any and all cultural appropriation or borrowing is being satirized, but there are signs that that's not the case. In fact, a certain type of cross-cultural writing is acceptable in this book. According to June, Candace, and Kuang herself in an NPR interview. Each of them focuses on the dangers of pigeonholing or forcing a writer to stay in a certain lane. In one of her Twitter statements in the novel, let's get to some of, oh, there it is, okay. So the question is writing outside your identity bad? Is something being set up for critique? And in one of her Twitter statements in the novel, June writes, "I understand this whole situation is racially fraught. It upsets me to see arguments that only Athena could have written the last front, because Athena's work was so concerned with Asian diaspora issues. This pigeonholes both of us and flattens our identities as writers." Okay? Because we generally don't sympathize with June, especially on the issue of appropriation, and this seems to be part of her rationalization of her theft, on its own, this statement seems to be held up for critique. Okay, this is part of the criticism of June. But near the end of the novel, in her confrontation with June, Candace, who is probably the purest and most sympathetic character in the novel, describes how Athena was problematically pigeonholed in terms that are very similar to the ones that June uses. And you can see the quote there. "They marked her as their token exotic Asian girl. Every time she tried to branch out to new projects, they kept insisting that Asian was her brand, was what her audience expected. Racial trauma sells, right? They treated her like a museum object, and she leaned into it too." So there's similarities in that language. And Kuang herself seems to share Candace's critique of forcing writers to stay in their identity lane. In an NPR interview with Mary Louise Kelly, Mary Louise Kelly noted that Kuang is an Asian American writing Yellowface from the point of view of a white woman. And Mary Louise Kelly basically asked, well, why did you do that? And here is Kuang's response. It's super long, but it's super revealing. So I'm going to read the whole thing. And here's her response. "I think it's hilarious." And note the word hilarious, because we're talking about humor here. We're talking about when is there a joke. Kuang says, "I think it's hilarious that all of our assumptions about who gets to do cultural appropriation or when something counts as cultural appropriation kind of go away when you invert who is of what identity. And I think that a lot of our standards about cultural appropriation are language about don't write outside of your lane. You can only write about this experience if you've had that experience. I don't think they make a lot of sense. I think they're actually quite limiting and harmful and backfire more often on marginalized writers than they push forward conversations about widening opportunities. You would see Asian American writers being told that you can't write anything except about immigrant trauma or the difficulties of being Asian American in the US. Very similar to Candace's critique. And I think that's anathema to what fiction should be. I think fiction should be about imagining outside our own perspectives, stepping into other people's shoes, and empathizing with the other." And then she goes on later in the interview to say, "And I'm playing with that argument by doing the exact thing that June is accused of, writing about an experience that isn't hers." So, rather than holding up June's view for critique like it seemed at first, Kuang seems to be holding it up for actual approval. Okay? Personally, I don't think it's perfectly symmetrical when you invert who is writing about whom. And I think the appropriation panel was great on this point because you do have to factor in history, the history of the oppression, which group has been dominant, which has been oppressed, the ongoing white domination of the publishing industry, the use of that power to stereotype or whitewash Asian experiences. And it would be too detailed and take too long, but we could go into some of the changes that June made to Athena's manuscript and analyze them in terms of that. And who profits from the story, all points that were really well made by the appropriation panel. So these are just some of the reasons cultural appropriation can sometimes be so problematic. Writing it, doing it badly is a whole other issue, which is also a part of this. And which for me makes it far less of an issue when somebody from the oppressed group takes on the perspective of somebody from the oppressing group. So I'm not with Kuang in terms of saying, oh, if you just flip it, it doesn't matter. I don't know, I wouldn't go that far. Having said that, for our purposes, what I want to emphasize is that we may feel the novel is not doing enough to explicitly satirize cultural appropriation in storytelling, but the reason for that seems to be that Kuang herself does not want to actually make that critique, or she wants to offer a complication to that critique. In fact, ironically, what is being satirized, or at least what Kuang finds hilarious, that's her sense of humor, are instances when people are inconsistent about who they call out for cultural appropriation. And in terms of our formula for the most recognizable LOL satire, it's telling that she does find hilarity simply when a profound and subtle irony exists, even without all the bells and whistles of obvious comic delivery. Amy Weiss Forbes, in her book, The Satiric Decade, Satire and the Rise of Republicanism in France, 1830 to 1840, you were waiting for me to get to some academic citation, weren't you? I give it to you at the end here. So she wrote this book about satire in France and how it was used politically in that 1830 to 1840 period. And her argument was that satire was useful for exposing ambiguities. That's her phrase. And I think that that is the type of satire that most interests Kuang. Subtle satire that exposes ambiguities. The problem of cultural appropriation for Kuang has ambiguities she wants to expose in satire so subtle that we as readers might not always be aware that an attitude we hold could be its subject. It's satire that doesn't always let us laugh comfortably at simple villains, but one that challenges us to think through the novel for ourselves and decide where the joke is or isn't. So that's that. Yeah. Oh, I didn't put that up, did I? Well, anyway, that was. So that's the end. You guys have questions?
Could you talk a little bit more about what exposing ambiguity means?
I think some of it is just pointing to it and saying, here, if you think of it this way, you might have that attitude towards it. If you think of it that way, you might have another attitude. So cultural appropriation, you might want to read it in a single direction, which is that it's always wrong. But if you think about it in terms of all these fuzzier categories, like what's the power dynamic, who has the right to say what, how well is it done, all of a sudden you're in a world where you can't just say cultural appropriation, good, bad. You're in a world where it's like, well, it depends. And if you're pointing to a situation where it depends, then you're forcing your reader to think, and you can't be laughing because it's not obvious enough.
Do you think the author's doing this within the novel or just outside the novel?
I think she's doing it in the novel because she is giving June and Candace the same idea. That was what was a tip-off for me. Because Candace is pretty much I don't know if she's a stand-in for Kuang. I don't want to go that far, but she's a truth teller. And we have no reason to doubt her opinion of that. And she also seems to give that same idea to Athena and say, Athena just leaned into it. Or she critiques Athena, actually. She's saying Athena let herself be pigeonholed because it gave her cultural prominence. Yeah. I don't know, that's my read of it anyway. Yeah.
But the author even still gives Athena a little bit of ambiguity because there's that little story where she wrote the story about the Korean War veterans, and not her culture, kind of appropriating that. So to me, that kind of blurred all that as well.
Yes. Yeah, Athena does a lot of appropriating. And it's also kind of a satire on writers as just very vampiric people who can't just write their own experience over and over again and are always grabbing other experiences to use. And that does cultural work, but it could also be bad cultural work. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just have a comment that the book, the story just seems it's layer on layer upon layer. And as I mentioned last week in another book discussion on the book, it was hard for me to separate Kuang from June. Somehow I couldn't, and maybe that's just my built-in bias, because then I started thinking, well, there's been cultural appropriation for decades in recent history,
Mhm.
And just think of those where you didn't think twice about who was telling the story.
Yeah. And I hope that what I take away from this book is just, you have to think through all the layers. You have to think through the power dynamic, you have to think of the history, you have to think of who's making money, like everything the cultural appropriation panel brought up. And also you have to think about artistic freedom, you have to think about when does an artist do something for the culture by going a place where they didn't start in their life, but they immersed themselves and they learned and they did a good job. But how do we know what a good job is? It's very easy to point a finger like you're out of your lane. It's much harder to say, is this good writing? Was that accurate? Is this respectful? Does this do justice? Those are judgment calls, and that's when that's another reason you're in that ambiguous space. And as a culture, it's just hard to talk about judgment calls. But it's much easier to say, you are of this background, you did this, that's not okay.
And then there's the whole political correctness thing and the cancel culture that you mentioned. It just seems like it can get in the way of good storytelling if it's not handled well.
That's right. And at the same time, the stuff that cancel culture calls out can be really bad, and it needs to be called out. So you're just stuck making judgments. And that's what I think a good book does. It forces you to make judgments. Yeah.
Did you have something that you wanted to
Oh, yeah.
share?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I don't know if you all are, we didn't know what type of crowd we're going to get. If we're going to get a writerly crowd or a readerly crowd. How many of you are interested in writing? Okay, cool. Well, I got a handout for you. So this is just trying to use some of the ideas from both that were exemplified in Yellowface and in my own experience with trying to write satire. And so I've structured a few exercises you could do. So one of them is, who does that? Satirizing people who behave badly. And here are some things you could step through if you wanted to write about that. So you could, in your journal, make a list of behaviors. And by behaviors, I mean things people habitually do, like the interrupter or the, I don't know, you know what I'm talking about, things that people do that annoy you regularly. And there are also specific actions that can be satirized. It's not a habitual thing, but it's a one-off, but it's really bad. Or somebody carries around ideas that you really don't like. And you make a list of those things, and maybe a few of them make you interested, okay? And then next to those on your list, you write down the character traits of somebody who you think might do those things. And then you write a scene in which that character holds that idea or performs that behavior in a self-satisfied, oblivious, or even proud way. Remember we talked about the mismatch being the humor thing? The mismatch is it's behavior you think is terrible, and the character's performing it in a self-satisfied, proud way, as if it's okay. And June does that a ton in this book, where she justifies trashing Candace or justifies stealing the text. And it's sort of like, I did a great thing here. I rewrote this book. I made it publishable. I elevated Athena's work. And then you decided how you want to play it. The more absurd and the more exaggerated you do it, the more you're committing yourself to a comedy and the logic of comedy, the less likely you are to get sort of pathos or like, heart stuff in your big payoff scenes. So you make your decisions on delivery. There's another one on your sheet there so that's really directly taking off from this book. The Misguided Proposal is probably the most famous sort of satire. And Swift's A Modest Proposal, which proposed that Irish families could ease their poverty by selling their children for food to rich people. How many of you have read A Modest Proposal? Yeah. So that it's devastating. It's such great satire. It's from the early 18th century. Lori Moore has a great story, How to Become a Writer. Okay, so the idea here, the mismatch here is you either give good instructions for the completion of a terrible thing or misguided instructions to reach a worthwhile goal. And you could say that alleviating poverty is a worthwhile goal, but killing and eating children is probably not the best way to get there. You can come up with your own topics, like ending online bullying by encouraging more in-person bullying, or something that's completely counterintuitive that you wouldn't want to do, like ruin all your friendships. But you can sort of satirize how we self-sabotage sometimes. So that's that one. That's another type of satire. And then there's just one more on your sheet, and that is, go ahead and complain. Satire often comes out of the things we don't like about the world. It's a way of venting and holding up for critique. And so in the voice of either yourself or a character, complain about something that you love to hate. And you might also do your little list in your journal and then come up with one you really like. David Sedaris is so good at this. His essay against computers called Nutcracker.com from Me Talk Pretty one day, he just straight up complains about them. He just rips on all their little problems. Or you can perform the thing in a way that demonstrates what you're satirizing. And the over-the-top Christmas newsletter, Season's Greetings to Our Friends and Family from Holidays on Ice. How many of you have read that one? It's fun. It's really fun. Especially if you've written one of those letters or gotten one. Anyway, so yeah, that's a great way to develop satire is just complain. Cool. Well, thanks for, go ahead.
Are you familiar with the Oscar-nominated film American Fiction?
I've heard of it. I have not seen it even.
There's a lot of striking similarities with the book. I'm just wondering what the connection was between, and maybe further why this particular issue of being pigeonholed is, there's a lot of those issues in that movie.
Yeah.
So why is it at the forefront of people's interest right now, or why do you think? Or is there any cyclicalness that you've seen in your study of satire?
First of all, I've never studied satire. I don't want to act like I did have one academic citation. But I love writing satire. So I think there's often a progression as we deal with a problem. So there was a problem of cultural appropriation, particularly white culture appropriating black culture through music, through all over the place. We know that's bad. Now we're refining our sense of what the problem is. So we get to the point where, as I think Kuang is saying, I know that white culture appropriated Asian culture or misrepresented it. We know that. But I also know that as an Asian American author, I don't always feel comfortable with how I'm framed, even by people who are trying to be friendly. And then you get these second level problems like, sure, you're letting me be my identity or what you think of as my identity, but I feel it's kind of limiting. And I want to be a free artist. I don't want to be pigeonholed or whatever. And so you get to these second order problems, which I think is a sign that we've hopefully gotten past the first level problem. I don't know. That's my theory right now. Okay.
Well,
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, fun.